next speaker is Luke Gliganic from Vicus. Luke Gliganic is a geoarchaeologist and a geochronologist, whose work has focused on developing luminescence techniques to understand complex archaeological sites and past environments. His recent research has focused on rock surface dating of lithic artifacts and stone structures, contributing innovative methods to the field of archaeological dating. Luke is going to talk about illuminating heritage stories using luminescence dating. Looking forward to it.
Thanks very much for that. First thing I'd like to do is, of course, pay my respects to the Whadjuk people on whose lands we're meeting today. I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of all the lands on which we work in all of our capacities, be it in the office, in the laboratory, and in the field. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Now my talk, as you kind of guessed from the introduction, is very archaeology focused. I am a geoarchaeologist by training, and that's what I do, and I'm a geochronologist, so I study how old archaeological sites are. So today I'm going to talk about how we can use luminescence dating to help to illuminate the stories that archaeological sites and archaeological objects can tell. So my goal with this talk is to show how knowing the chronology of an archaeological site or object can help us make better heritage management decisions by better understanding the stories and significance of those sites and objects from a Western scientific perspective. So to start, I'm going to do a little exercise here. So this is the assemblage from an archaeological site here in Australia that was excavated in the 2010s. On the left, we've got some of the stone artifacts, photos of the stone artifacts. In the middle, we have a piece plot distribution of the artifacts down profile at the site. And on the right, we have a qualitative description of some of the assemblage. So you can tell it's clearly a very impressive site, right? It's really a big assemblage. It's a very diverse assemblage. Clearly significant in and of itself, right? But if we want to try to understand what this lithic assemblage means in a broader context, right? How does this relate to other archaeological sites in the paleoenvironmental record, in the local, regional, and global scale? Can we really do that with just the assemblage by itself? I would argue not. You probably need to put it on some kind of a scaffold, a temporal scaffold, so that you can compare it to other records and other sites around the world. And of course, this site was dated, and it was dated to 65,000 years old. This is Majubibi. Dating this site pushed back our understanding of Aboriginal occupation of Australia by a whole 15,000 years. So this site is known globally because it was dated and understood in its temporal and spatial context. Right? That adds a whole new level to the assemblage that, well, the assemblage by itself didn't necessarily reflect. So the assemblage by itself, while really interesting and significant, kind of didn't tell the whole story. The chronology of that assemblage told a story of occupation, of long-term connection to landscape, and adaptation to a new environment and new climate and new environments. So, of course, this is a bit of a hyperbolic example, but I think one that kind of makes my point. So what I'll do in the next couple of slides is go through a bit of a point-by-point set of reasons why geochronology, knowing the age of archaeological sites, is important. So first is a bit of an academic reason. Kind of knowing the age of archaeological sites helps us to understand the story of human and environmental interactions, of kind of adaptation and evolution, right? We need to know the ages of archaeological sites so that we can compare them to each other to understand how people behaved, interacted, moved around the landscape, evolved over time. So this, for example, is a map of human distributions or migrations around the globe over kind of the late Pleistocene. So this map, right, is developed from archaeogenetic data, but also dating of tens of thousands of archaeological sites around the world. If we didn't have ages for those sites, we wouldn't be able to make a map like this and understand kind of our own evolution. Second, knowing the age of archaeological sites helps us to validate or challenge historical stories, theories, and narratives. So again, let's take occupation of Australia by Aboriginal people. In the 1990s, science suggested that Australia was occupied 40,000 years ago. By the 2000s, science had evidence that Australia was occupied 50,000 years ago. And by 2017, we have evidence that Australia was occupied at least 65,000 years ago. My point is, better resolution chronologies for archaeological sites have kind of given us a more accurate picture of when Australia was occupied. I should just say it keeps kind of reflecting what Aboriginal people already know and keep telling us, so maybe we should listen a little bit more to that also. Third, knowing the ages of archaeological sites can help us to reveal and support deep time connections to country. So we all know that archaeological sites have a kind of a strong relationship with current populations over deep time, but that's kind of the key point. We need to know the ages of archaeological sites to be able to relate them to modern people living today. I'm not going to talk too much about this case study here because I'm going to talk about it in depth a bit later, but this was a study we did dating a stone arrangement in the Pilbara in Banjima country that showed long-term, so 1,000-year, more than 30 generations connection to an individual site. And finally, and this is kind of the so what reason to cite Kylie's talk from earlier today, those first 3 points kind of go to build up an understanding of the significance and the kind of the scientific value of archaeological sites. And that significance and that value should really go towards giving us better information to make more informed heritage management decisions over time. So for example, UNESCO World Heritage Listing for the Willander Lakes out in New South Wales, the first sentence of that description includes a reference to the age of the landscape, the cultural landscape, twice. To take another site that's kind of close to where I live in Sydney, the Parramatta sand body, it's a 40-ish thousand-year-old sand body that is in the middle of a kind of Parramatta, as you could guess. And anytime somebody wants to do developments in the Parramatta sand body, they need to go through more intensive archaeological, say, assessments, because it has the potential to contain evidence for occupation kind of in this deep time space. If we didn't know the age of this landform, the Parramatta sand body, then it would just be another pile of sand and probably wouldn't get the same level of protection that it does now. So I hope I've kind of expressed that knowing the age of archaeological sites can contribute value to what those sites can tell us. Now I'm going to talk about the method that I use to do geochronology, and that's luminescence dating. So luminescence dating, at its core, is a way, we can use it to say when grains of quartz or feldspar, so when mineral grains, were last exposed to sunlight and then buried. We can also tell when mineral grains were heated to high temperatures. So in practice, what we can do is we can tell when sediment bodies, when landforms were deposited, and how those sites and landforms evolved over time. We can also tell when rock surfaces were buried. So for example, lithic artifacts. We can also tell whether and when things like rocks, bricks, and sediments were last heated to high temperatures. So for example, we can tell when heat retainers or bricks were made. And we do all this by looking at tiny light emissions from individual grains of quartz and feldspar. So I'm going to walk through at a very, very high level how this process works by following an individual sand grain as it moves through its kind of cycle through geological cycle through the environment. So we've got our little schematic sand grain here as a circle, and the amount of luminescence signal, the amount of latent luminescence signal accumulated in that grain is represented by the amount of blue that fills the grain. So our mineral grains start in their host rock, right? The grains are formed in their whatever granites or sandstones or whatever rock they form in, and that little grain is sitting there entombed in rock and it's not exposed to sunlight. It has a completely saturated full luminescence signal. When that rock erodes, and those grains are now blowing around the landscape, say in dunes, for example, transported by wind, they're exposed to sunlight energy, and the luminescence signal is completely zeroed and reset in those grains, kind of resetting the clock. At some point, those grains come to rest in some landform, some deposit, in this case an archaeological deposit, and those grains are buried. They're shielded from sunlight. Now, as that grain is shielded from sunlight, the luminescence signal in those grains begin to accumulate as a function of burial time. Now, it's actually the signal accumulates as a function of exposure to ionizing radiation in the environment, but we're staying very high level here, so for our purposes, we could just think of it as luminescent signal increases as a function of burial time. And there's chronological information about how long that grain was buried and the intensity of the luminescence signal that we can measure in those grains. Now, this method has really strong, broad application to date lots of different kinds of Earth surface processes, from kind of river-transported sediments to wind-blown sediments to gravity deposits and all kinds of different things. It's been used it's a staple of the quaternary science field of study. And of course, we can also date lots of archaeological deposits. We can directly date sediments. We can also directly date rock surfaces. We can date deposits as young as decades. So this is something where we have some benefits over radiocarbon, where you can't date in the last couple of hundred years because of calibration issues. And we can also date back to about 200,000 years. So getting back there past the radiocarbon age limit of about 50,000 years. Now, as I said, conventional luminescence dating of sediments has been a pretty standard practice for about 25 years. There's probably tens of thousands of academic papers that have used luminescence dating in the course of those studies. Luminescence dating has helped us determine the age of the oldest archaeological sites in Australia and in the Americas. And kind of globally, it's been used in a lot of different contexts. So I want to just, conventional luminescence dating of sediments is great, but I just want to kind of step back now and think about what it is. So how can we improve on that, right? I want to step back and think about what it is we actually want to date, and then what it is that we're actually dating. So when we as archaeologists, or me as an archaeologist, what I want to date is the object itself, right? Let's take a lithic artifact, for example. But we almost never directly date lithic artifacts. We pretty much always date lithic artifacts by stratigraphic association with some other material that's datable. So for example, using radiocarbon to date charcoal, or using luminescence dating to date the sand that the artifact is deposited in. And I mean, as I just showed in the last slide, that has generally worked really super well. It's helped us improve our understanding of the archaeological record immensely over the last 25 years. However, there are many different types of archaeological sites that don't have secure stratigraphic associations, so pretty much anything on the surface, right? So stone structures, rock engravings, raw material lithic quarry sites, surface artifact scatters, none of these things can be dated by stratigraphic association with something that's datable because they don't have those stratigraphic associations. Wouldn't it be great if we could just directly date those objects? And then even when we do have buried archaeological deposits, what about post-depositional movement of the objects we're interested in and the materials that we're dating? And again, I just bring up Majid Bebe here because there is some debate in the scientific literature, so specifically more in the kind of geomorphology space, about whether or not there's been so much post-depositional movement of the artifacts and sands kind of in the lower parts of the deposit, whether the artifacts are actually 65,000 years old. Now, I'm not saying I agree with that. In fact, I don't agree with it. But the point here is just to say, if we could just directly date the artifacts themselves, as opposed to the sand they're buried in, then there's no space for debate. We're directly dating the artifacts that we want to know the age of. And so over the last 15 years or so, luminescence rock surface dating, so dating rock surfaces instead of dating sand grains, has been a kind of a developing field of study, and my research over the last 10 years has focused on directly dating lithic artifacts themselves. We've been able to date the burial of rock surfaces from a range of different lithologies, from quartzites to granophyres to sandstones and granites. Again, we've got the same age range as conventional luminescence dating, from decades to hundreds of thousands of years. Some really cool things that we can do with rock surface dating. We can observe bleaching and burial histories in a single class. So there was one of the artifacts we dated that was from Tibet. We could observe that it was made and used, then discarded. Then at some point later, somebody picked it up and used it for a short amount of time and then discarded it again. And we got all of that from luminescence data from that one individual artifact. And so this method's been used in the archaeological sciences to date artifact scatters, buried artifacts in South Africa and here in Australia, and placed pavements, rockfall events that are associated with rock art in Europe and the Americas, and stone structures, kind of, again, in a global context. Now, it should go without saying that any work that's being done needs to be done in consultation with the traditional owners of whatever group you're working with, and I would just say that goes especially for rock surface dating. because in order to get the measurements we're interested in, we need to impact on the artifacts. So we need to collect some small cores, so 2 or 3 10-millimeter diameter cores from the artifacts, and that's where we get our measurements from. So that's just to say, I mean, I wouldn't say just consultation, but emphatic support of the traditional owners and a real desire to do this dating is really necessary. And in fact, at Vicus, at our lab, we won't accept samples for rock surface dating unless we have signed agreements with the traditional owner groups of wherever the studies are being done. Okay, so that's the background. Now we're going to talk about some case studies where we've used luminescence dating to let the archaeological sites and archaeological objects tell a deeper story than we got from just the artifacts themselves. So this is a study we did dating a stone arrangement on Banjima country in the Pilbara. This is a distribution of, we can just leave it there. This is a distribution of stone arrangements around the Paxsettle Valley in the Pilbara. And stone arrangements are an awesome site type, right? They're almost ubiquitous around Australia, but there's not a ton of, at least from an archaeological perspective, there's not a ton of understanding about how the sites were used or anything like that. And part of the reason is, kind of, as we talked about a little bit earlier, they're on the surface. They're very difficult to date, so we can't really understand them within their archaeological and environmental contexts. So what we did is we excavated, in 2017, I think, we excavated a stone arrangement complex, as I said, on Banjima country, up in the Pilbara. It was a complex of 4 individual stone arrangements that each had 20 to 50 emplaced stones in them. We excavated 25 or so of the stones. We had to do it in the dark because, of course, our signals are light sensitive. So we put our homemade tent over the stones. We excavated them, collected some sediments from underneath the stones, and then re-emplaced them before we finished. So the good thing about this method is the site was effectively, it looked the same. There was 0 visual impact after we were done with our excavations. We, of course, tested some natural soil profiles to make sure that we weren't just measuring kind of soil mixing processes, and we could see that our ages were in fact reflecting anthropogenic activity. And these are the ages that we got from all 26 of the stones we measured. So what we have here are a rank age plot of the ages we got at the stone arrangement complex. The blue line is a kernel density estimate of those ages. And then the bottom figure is those ages plotted again as a function of their specific site within the complex. So the first thing that I want to draw your attention to is the youngest ages here. So we also collected samples from 4 boulders that had fallen down. So we call them recumbent boulders. And all 4 of the recumbent boulders yield the youngest ages we got in our entire kind of distribution. They all cluster around 380 years ago. So that was interesting in and of itself. Next, you can probably clearly see there's 3 peaks in stone arrangement boulder emplacement. So that represents 3 phases of boulder emplacement. So these are statistically consistent populations of emplacement ages. And those ages are 1,360 years ago, 800, and 480 years ago. And finally, all phases are reflected in effectively all of the kind of specific arrangements at our complex site. That's just to say the phases don't relate to a specific site. It's not like one site was made one time and then another site was made another time. So our interpretation of this data was that phases of boulder emplacement represent phases of site maintenance over time, right? These boulders fall down by natural processes. There's lots of bioturbation and pedoturbational processes working out there. So boulders fall down. And people would come back over time and re-emplace the boulders. And we have we've been able to observe 3 phases when people did this. At 1,300 years ago, 800 years ago, and 480 years ago. By 380 years ago, site maintenance had ceased. Now, there's some evidence from some colleagues who dated some other stone arrangements in the area that show younger ages, so it's possible that the locus of stone arrangement activity shifted across the landscape over time, but again, not sure. I think the point, though, the take-home message, is that the ages for this stone arrangement site tell a story of 1,000 years, right, more than 30 generations of connection to this specific site, maintenance of this specific site over time. And I think that's really super interesting. That's something that just the arrangement itself, looking at it from an archaeological perspective, didn't tell. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is some work that I've been doing with Joe McDonald as a part of the ARC-funded Dating Morujuga's Dreaming Linkage Project. So Amy did a really nice presentation on Moorjigga yesterday, so I don't need to do too much of an introduction. Thank you, Amy. We're in the coastal Pilbara, and there's a hyperabundance of rock engravings, but what we were interested in for this talk is the abundant stone structures that we have out at Moorjigga. So we were interested in trying to date when some of these stone structures were constructed using a rock surface dating approach. So we went to Old Geos. It's a stone structure in Midden site that had been excavated by Joe and the team in 2017. And we went there with a specific aim of trying to determine when the structures themselves were built. So last year, we excavated a 1x1 through the wall of one of these structures. We collected samples for sediment luminescence dating using conventional OSL. That would tell us about site use. We collected stone artifacts, again, for rock surface dating of the lithic artifacts to say something about site use. And we collected samples from the boulders that make up the wall of the arrangement to try to tell something about site construction. And this is all kind of a bit preliminary. It's a bit of a work in progress. We're still processing the samples, but the results are so far looking really interesting. So the conventional luminescence ages of sediments are consistent with the 2017 ages. So that's great. That's kind of what we expected. We're looking at mid and early Holocene use of the site. We're still working on the rock surface burial ages of the boulders that make up the wall. So those are being prepared and measured this year. So hopefully we'll have results about construction of the site later on this year. But the rock surface burial ages of the artifacts are really interesting. So the ages themselves are consistent with the sediment ages. So that's great. Again, that's what we would expect. It tells us there's not much post-depositional mixing at the site itself. Again, early to mid-Holocene occupation of the site. But what's really interesting that we can observe in the rock surface luminescence data is that 3 of the 4 artifacts show really clear evidence for having been heated. Now, that's something that we couldn't have observed really in any other way. There was no kind of physical evidence on the surface that these artifacts had been heated. And we're not sure what's going on there. It would actually be really interesting. Raylene, I see you. It'd be really interesting to talk to you about what your thoughts are there. But it could be that this reflects bushfire activity. It could be that the raw materials were heated to improve knapping qualities. There's lots of possibilities, but again, it's the ages themselves and the luminescence data is giving us this. They're letting the artifacts tell a bit more of a story about their history than we could have gotten from just looking at the artifacts by themselves. So I hope you can see some usefulness in geochronology and specifically luminescence dating and trying to better understand archaeological sites and archaeological materials. Luminescence dating has been in the past, it's been pretty difficult to utilize, right? It's been kind of siloed at universities, which are doing excellent work, but it makes it hard for other people to get in and get their samples run. And so that's one of the reasons why we've kind of started Vicus. That's to make luminescence dating more accessible to effectively anybody who wants access to this technology. We've also worked really hard to get timeframes for sample preparation and sample processing down to timescales that make sense for making these heritage management decisions and project deliverables that consultants would need. So ages for conventional luminescence dating are delivered in 8 weeks. That's the kind of thing that can actually go into heritage assessments and reports. We also offer rock surface burial dating, again with the caveat that we need the support and signed agreements from the traditional owners and everybody involved. And we think that that's going to be the real game changer in terms of understanding the Australian archaeological record. Doing the rock surface dating of artifacts really lets us date way more archaeological sites than you can using conventional methods, right? Even in sites that have been post-depositionally mixed by natural process, but also by kind of historical colonial processes. If you're measuring the ages of the artifacts themselves, you can still date when that site was being used in the past. And so we think that that's got a lot of scope in the future, and we hope that we can let the ages for archaeological sites kind of do the talking and tell deeper stories in that way. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke. We have time for a couple of questions, if anyone wants to make any question.
Yes, hi. When you talk about the heat and heating, is that around climate change? As Mother Earth is getting hotter and hotter, are we talking about, ancient volcanoes, bulk earthworks being done around the rock art? What do you mean when you say, the heating?
Yep, nope, totally. So in this case, it means that the artifact itself, right, so something that's about the size of the pointer here, was heated completely through to a temperature of about 400 degrees Celsius. So this would have to be something that happened to that individual artifact. So it wouldn't have to do with climate change or anything like that. That's making all the rocks kind of hot, but not hot enough to reset the signal that we are looking at to a depth that we're looking at. So it really has to be something like being put in a fire or something like that. So that individual rock, though. And I should also say there were some artifacts that were not heated. So it's something that had happened to only some of the artifacts that we were looking at.
Can you just tell us what period that would be when the heating occurred?
Sorry, can you?
Do you know what period the heating occurred?
Yeah, so one of those artifacts is about 3,000 years old, and two of the other artifacts are 8,000 years old. So kind of this happened in at least two different phases, which was interesting.
What's the definition of an artifact? Why do you call it an artifact if it still exists? Sorry. Did you hear me?
Yeah, I did, yeah, thanks. So the question for anybody online was, what's the definition of an artifact? Why am I calling them artifacts? Yeah, no, I mean, I guess this is like you could say stone tool, you could say anything like that. It's really just a lithic, so a rock fragment that was kind of altered or made by somebody in the past. That's kind of the definition of artifact that I'm using in this context.
So if the Aboriginal people that existed and it's their land, shouldn't they be owning that artifact, in a sense, the tool that you've discovered?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, this entire project has been done in collaboration with the Morjiga Aboriginal Corporation and the Circle of Elders up there.
I've just got a question in terms of helping with future preventing ionizing radiation from affecting the samples that are collected. So obviously when you're collecting in situ, you've got your whole setup, but how long have you actually got from when an artifact is recovered from somewhere, and are there ways that you have that you would recommend for institutions that have those sort of collections to help keep those objects in a way that would make them able to be analysed with luminescence dating in the future?
Totally. So the signal that we're looking at is light sensitive. So it's exposure to light that resets the luminescence signal. And so, what we did, for example, in our excavations in South Africa and places is we would be excavating and we would identify an artifact while we're excavating by hand and then try to kind of assess whether it was an artifact in kind of less than 30 seconds and then quickly wrap it in aluminum foil, so keeping it light safe. And then we would bring it back to the laboratory. And in the laboratory, so we can look at anything in red light. So our laboratories are kind of like photographic darkrooms. We unwrap the artifacts, and then we record them just like anybody would who's doing classical archaeological kind of artifact recording. We also do, we make 3D models using photogrammetry of the artifact, so it's a digital recording of that artifact. So anyway, to answer your question, it would need to be preserved from light. So anything that's in a museum collection right now would probably not have its luminescence signal preserved.
Awesome, thank you.
Any more questions?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.